Transgender people make us uncomfortable. And by us, I mean cisgender people like myself, people whose gender identity is more typical than a trans person's is considered to be. And I don't say that they make us uncomfortable in order to place any blame on transgender folks for that situation, because I don't think the blame is theirs. I think the blame is ours, and I think the responsibility for correcting that situation is also ours. There are two stories from recent news that I want to specifically mention in this video as I'm talking about this, one of which I have a sort of personal connection to because it involves a friend of mine, and one of which took place in Baltimore, which is not terribly far from where I live. So I have a proximity in a sense to both of these stories, but they are both examples of how widespread and commonplace and tolerated transphobic attitudes, transphobic language is. And in one of these cases, I don't think it is even intended maliciously. I think one of these cases that I'm about to talk to you about, in fact, the first one, is not a case of intentional transphobia. It's just sort of incidental. It's a result of ignorance, not malice or any sort of intentional bigotry. And that story is the story of a woman, a transgender woman named Maya Hall, and I'll show you the newspaper story, or the news story. There's really no such thing as a newspaper anymore, is there? The news story about what happened to her. This is from the Daily Dot, and this is the story of Maya Hall, who was killed late last month, and she was in a stolen car with a friend of hers, and she was killed outside the gates of the Baltimore headquarters of the NSA. And I'm not going to talk to you about this story and pretend that I fully understand it or pretend that there is anything typical about this story. There you see a mugshot of Maya Hall. But what I find really troubling about the way it was covered is how much transphobic language I see in the various articles written about it. And in this article I'm showing you here, which I will link in the description for this video, this article comes from the Daily Dot. That's the website that this is taken from, and it has a good summary of the coverage of the story. It quotes from the Washington Post article referring to it. And I notice in the article that Maya Hall and her friend Brittany Fleming, who is also a trans woman who was not killed in the incident but was in the SUV with her, are referred to as men dressed as women or as transvestites. And they're also frequently misgendered in the various reports, referred to as men or referred to as he rather than women or she. And I don't think that this is necessarily the result of any conscious transphobia on the part of the reporters, on the part of these newspapers. I think it's just a matter of ignorance. And I know from personal experience, even people like me who try to avoid doing that sort of thing, who make an effort to treat trans folks according to the gender they identify as, rather than the gender that they were assigned by society at birth. Even we find it difficult sometimes to keep from misgendering people because we're so conditioned to look at people a certain way or to consider people as belonging to certain categories, even though they no longer consider themselves in those categories. I was fortunate enough to meet a friend of mine, a fellow YouTuber of mine, a few weeks ago, who is a trans woman, and I misgendered her at one point during our conversation. I referred to her as him instead of her. And I suppose I could make excuses for myself and say, well, but I've known her since she was a him, and I just forgot. And that's really what happened. But the point is, it was my error. I made a mistake, and I corrected it, and I should have corrected it. And she was kind enough to remind me, to point it out, and to say, I have to correct you. You said him, and you should have said her. And I was grateful for it. I was a little embarrassed. I was a little disappointed in myself, but I was grateful to be corrected on it. And I gladly received the correction and strove not to make that mistake again. But that's a mistake that many of us don't even realize we're making. And it's sort of a correction that I think some of us cisgender folks kind of resent, as though a trans person doesn't have the right to expect to be treated the way they want to be treated, or to be referred to according to the gender that they identify as. And I find that really unfortunate. And it reflects really badly on we cis folk. It's not that I don't understand the emotions that underlie it. And I know that sometimes if you haven't been acquainted with trans folk before, maybe it can be confusing. It's new, it's different. I understand that. I understand the apprehension. I understand the confusion. But what I don't understand is the refusal to put forth an effort. And the other thing that upsets me is when the very fact of a person's transness is used to discredit them. And that brings me to the second story I wanted to talk to you about in this video. And this has to do with a friend of mine, not the trans friend that I mentioned earlier, but another trans woman who I'm very grateful to be friends with and to know, who I've also had the opportunity to meet in person and hang out with, and she was awesome too. And of course I'm talking about my good friend Stephanie Guttormson, who is being sued by a so-called faith healer for defamation or whatever, because she made a couple of videos declaring her opinion that there's no such thing as faith healing and that this faith healer is a fraud. An opinion in general that I completely agree with. I don't think there's any such thing as faith healing. I don't think if you claim to be a faith healer, if you claim to be healing people through some mystical means or whatever, I have never seen any evidence to independently establish that such a thing is even possible, or that such a thing even happens. But I don't want to specifically talk about the lawsuit in this video. I want to talk about the transphobic rhetoric that this faith healer used to attempt to discredit Stephanie and to attempt to discredit her criticisms of him. I've looked at the legal case, and what you're seeing on your screen right now is a GoFundMe page that Steph set up to help fund her legal bills, because she is being sued. She is going to have to go to court to answer what I would consider to be a frivolous lawsuit, a nuisance suit. I don't think that this guy has a single leg to stand on in this lawsuit, but nonetheless, she's been summoned and she has to answer this lawsuit. So she's raising funds to help out with that on GoFundMe, and there's a link to this GoFundMe page in the description of this video as well that you can contribute to if you think that's something you'd like to do. I would highly urge you to do so, because it is a good cause. But the faith healer in question posted a response video to Steph's criticisms of him, and it's just rife with transphobic language, as though the very fact of her being a trans woman was enough to discredit her, was enough to make us doubt her opinion or her reliability as a skeptic of faith healing or a skeptic of woo and pseudoscience or whatever. Both the faith healer himself and several and two people that he also interviewed in his response video refer to her as though she's being dishonest by being a trans person. She can't even live. They misgender her several times, and they don't get off the hook for misgendering her. They refer to her as he, and they're making a point of doing so. They refer to her as not being able to accept who she is, not being able to accept that she's a man, not a woman, and all these other really ugly things that, you know, I can imagine if I were a trans person, it would be very upsetting for me to hear this sort of thing, and especially to hear it as often as trans people have to hear this sort of thing. And what I find ironic about that, and I've said this in another video I did a 5 Stupid Things video about transphobia a while back, and I don't understand this criticism, this insult, really, that a lot of people throw at trans people. They say things about them like, well, they just can't accept who they are. And actually, it's you who can't accept who they are. If you're saying that about a trans person, if you say about a trans person, well, they just can't accept who they are, you're the one who can't accept who they are. You're the one who can't accept that they're a trans person. You're the one with the problem. You're the one who has trouble identifying people, not them, not the trans person that you're directing your attack to. It's you. You're the one with the problem. Which brings me full circle all the way back around to we just need to get over it. That is the solution to all of these problems. That is the solution to get rid of this sort of casual, often unintentional transphobia, anti-trans, trans-denying language from media stories that cover events that have to do with trans people, like in the case of Maya Hall. And it's the way we get rid of people feeling empowered and entitled to employ blatant transphobia in an attempt to discredit people who they view as adversaries. Both of those go away if we as a culture can get to the point where us cis folk simply get the fuck over it. And we accept that our confusion and our frustration and our uncertainty about how to treat trans people and what to do and all of this, that it's on us to fix. That it's not a trans person's fault. Life is a beautiful thing. Life can be a beautiful thing. And life in this country, in this civilization that we've created for ourselves, can be a really wonderful, rewarding experience. And it breaks my heart how many people have an inferior experience. How many people live a life of rejection and suffering and sadness and marginalization just because the rest of us, who are lucky enough to have been born into privileged categories, who are lucky enough to have been what is considered typical in our culture, are blind to the benefits that we have received through no effort of our own, and are also blind to the responsibilities that we have to other people who suffer at the hands of the same system that has privileged us. And we could make life so much better for people who just so happen to be underprivileged relative to us. Trans folk relative to cis folk, gay folks relative to straight folks, women relative to men, people of color relative to white folks, poor people, people living in poverty relative to rich people or people at least doing okay financially. There are all these interactions often going on simultaneously between privileged folks and underprivileged folks. And if those of us who usually find ourselves on the privileged side of things would just recognize the situation and make an effort, and it doesn't even usually take that much of an effort, to make life a little bit better, to try and lift people up, to try and treat people like people, to show a little bit of humanity and a little bit of humanism and a little bit of compassion and empathy to other people, and just try to make life a little bit better for those who, through no fault of their own, have a few more obstacles to overcome than we do, then life would be so much better for all of us. For the collective species of humanity, life would be so much better. But it's not their responsibility. It's our responsibility. It's on us. We are not owed. We owe. The trans folks don't owe it to us cis folks to make us more comfortable or to fix themselves, to come more in line with what we think they should be. They don't owe it to us. We owe it to them.